Welcome to Saltwater Reasonings, a listening library for critical conversation, reflection, and collective knowing. This space is rooted in the Caribbean traditions of reasoning, embodiment, and incision creativity, where knowledge emerges through reflection, movement, and lived experience. In this episode, I'm in conversation with Adeola Dewis. We reflect on how experiences of displacement and identity fracture are carried in the body, and how performance can offer ways to represent the self in moments of rupture. Adéọlá and I think together about migration and mask, about embodiment and improvisation, and about how performance creates new vocabularies for survival, self-representation, and becoming. This is a shared space of reflection, story, and presence. When you hear the phrase performing self, what image comes to mind?
To be honest, I feel like when I hear performing self, I think about Carnival. I think about the phrase play yourself and what it means to have that opportunity to be occupying a space where you're allowed to bring to the fore an expression of yourself that may have been suppressed, a much needed expression of yourself that may have been suppressed, in order to then function best in your everyday. It also kind of triggers another thing as well. Performing self also kind of triggers the notion of masking and what it means to be operating in different cells and different spaces and different places. And that operation of self is due to migration, it's due to location or placement in space that allows you to function best within the space that you're in. So the idea of multiple selves and being able to
Yeah.
perform a self in different spaces. I see those two kind of simultaneous.
I feel like that is the perfect grounding and framing for the reasoning we're going to have happen today. This idea of occupying multiple spaces and the way that the self shows up differently in different spaces as well. The self is evolving. And I think situating that in Carnival. And yeah, I love that. So let's jump into it. When we're going to talk a lot about your work and who you are. So I'm going to start by just asking, who are you? Where are you coming from? And what has brought you to your work?
I've been thinking about this idea of self and who is Adéọlá and all of this quite recently. So a Trini girl, born in Trinidad, currently living in Wales, but very much forged by Trinidad and circumstances around Trinidad. A sister, a daughter, and now a mother, you know? The work that I do now, the research that I do now is very much rooted in experiences of migration and living outside of home space and some of the
Yeah.
things that came up because of that movement from home space to other place. And I am pretty convinced that I would not be doing what I'm doing now had I not moved to another location. Yeah, because the key questions are around feelings of displacement and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I see myself as an artist. This is the long answer to your question. I see myself as an artist and recognize quite explicitly that that is a choice that I've made. It is something that I've carried for a very long time and something that remains a label that I feel comfortable occupying,
Mm-hmm.
but that recognizing very recently that with that notion of that word artist, I had already sort of imposed certain criteria that make someone successful an artist, and that I now have a choice to say I occupy this, but that the definitions around what that is to be successful or unsuccessful are mine that I've placed, that I've imposed on this title that I
Yeah.
claim. That essentially I am all of it and none of it,
So you said that, you've recently been grappling with how you show up and how you are in your art. I've known your work for a long time, decade. A short age here. I've had the just the fortune to have known your work for many, many years, and I've always seen you in your work. Yeah, like literally, I've seen you. And so this is me looking at your work, right? All your pieces, I feel, has been an expression, a representation of you as a human, as a woman occupying space. So I'm curious about how did place, movement, and migration shape or change your creative voice?
The long answer?
Bring the long answer.
Hmm. It happened in stages. I would say in Trinidad, I did my first degree in Trinidad, and my first degree was in visual arts. And it was the right routing, the right routing for me, sincerely. I look back at that time quite fondly. It was a space where at the end of it, I felt like I could take on the world. I could do anything, right? And moving to Wales not long after graduating, 2 years after, 2 or 3 years after graduating, pursuing a master's in fine arts. And I don't know if a master's program is generally supposed to do this, but it was quite an upheaval, kind of testing, recalibrating. There were a lot of, and I think it's also because, and I've heard this echoed in different sort of scenarios. I think it's also because of it being not in home space. So I came across certain things that I hadn't needed to encounter previously. And one of those things was the idea of seeing yourself through the eyes of another, the self consciousness, being conscious
Oh,
of yourself both as object and subject.
mhm.
Whereas in Trinidad, you're doing your thing and it's
Yeah.
you and you explain it. Whereas here it was about attempting to do your thing, recognizing that you're already placed in a box, a stereotype of what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to behave within certain spaces. And having that capacity to then grow a sense of being able to see yourself being seen, the
Mm,
self consciousness that I had to grow, that
mm,
it wasn't something inherent
yeah,
part of my growing up experience. So there was that shift. And then for me, there was also a sort of a return to Carnival. So
yeah.
I was, as I'm a fine artist, I'm a painter, I draw. When I went into my master's, I was very much exploring because we danced together, right? We went with Hazel and we were dancing together. And so for
Yeah.
me, it was that question around how do I combine my dance and my art practice? And that led me quite naturally to performance art. But here in this country, coming from Trinidad, what I was exploring was very much criticized around the politics of the Black female body. Everything was hypersexualized. And I mean, you know me, I'm petite, so there was in Trinidad, yeah, I'm not, my body type isn't really associated with anything hypersexual because of the tendencies of what is seen as voluptuous and beautiful. So being considered
Mhm.
hypersexualized in my performance was interesting. And there were other things as well about, art being very much in Trinidad, like 10 years behind, and all of those kinds of critiques that I was kind of grappling with and not finding my fit until, of course, I decided to utilize what I knew, which was going back to paper and drawing, and then turning my drawing into a costume. So this was very much about drawing a mask, wearing an old vest and drawing a body on it and, becoming the perfect woman that I draw. There's, women that
Mm,
are seated behind you, becoming,
mhm.
wearing her. And then having the opportunity to go to Trinidad during carnival time, wearing this costume. And her name was Canvas, Canfas, Canvas. And in Canvas, walking through the streets of a carnival Tuesday, two elderly gentlemen looked at her and said, "That is math," right? Now, interestingly for me, I hadn't yet associated her with mass. I thought she was
Yeah.
performance art, right? She was me in costume,
Yeah.
performing art. And the granting of that title as mass for me led me to my PhD because it became how can this art piece be mass in the middle of carnival with dancing bodies in costume, in carnival costumes? What
Mhm.
made canvas mass? And in that question of what made canvas mass, the ultimate question is then what is mass? And so a lot of my work then moved into exploring the intrinsic qualities of this thing called mass and what it means to operate in mass outside of Carnival. So, playing with that idea and kind of trying to tease apart the ritual and then to see what bits can be useful in terms of a mass aesthetic, you know, inside and outside of Carnival, particularly in diaspora spaces. So outside of home space. So that was sort of like the first shift in my practice. And then I think much later on, 2017, the work shifted again and went back to mark making in a different kind of way that was more about fabric and less sort of representational woman and more sort of just like back to basics, like what is this thing and how do we wear it and how can we show it again, moving into like garments and that kind of thing. So yeah, migration, upheaval, all of those things sort of informed the work. Did that
Mhm.
answer the question?
It does. So I'm tracking you as you take us on this journey, right? And it's this, I'm home, I'm in a space, I am free, I'm myself, I don't think about being, I am. And then I'm in another space and I'm still making my work, but I'm aware of being seen by others, but also by seeing others who are not necessarily part of my community. And I use that word, that term community as nationality, right? Who see me as other and they are othered from me and I am other from them. And it's so fascinating as I track your work to see how it feels almost rhythmic. Like your work is in dialogue and it is a call and response and it feels delicate and intuitive and also necessary at the same time. And I'm wondering as this dance and you also couch it in dance. I forgot I used to dance until you said it. I was like, yeah, we danced together in another lifetime. But it feels like this beautiful dance. And I wonder if you can reflect about this. How has living in different places affected your relationship with Carnival?
Hmm. Hmm. I think two things happen. Uh, one is perhaps a deeper appreciation for it, because at home, perhaps I may have taken it for granted. It was just what I did, you know? I knew what it made me feel like. I knew that whole feeling of renewal, rejuvenation, rebirth, you know. Particularly speaking about Juve. And so I knew that intrinsically. I say taken for granted because I hadn't seen it as something beyond that experience, and I think it was being outside of home space that I realized what that carnival gave me. So being outside of home space meant that there was a carnival here at the time, but it didn't allow, my body wasn't fully allowed to do and be what it was in Trinidad. And I understand that, the Trinidad context, the land, the island is rooted in a specific history, a specific context, that the island is rich with ancestral blood and all of that, right?
Yeah.
And that collectively as a community, as a nation, when we stomp on the ground, there's a
Hmm.
reverberation of something that's happening, right?
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
I recognize because it's been exported since the beginning of time, that there are echoes of our carnival in these spaces. Yet, while the new spaces sort of take these precious fragments and not only recreate, but then also uh, merge with whatever is local to space, to their space or their place. What my body missed was what was happening in Trinidad, right? So
Yeah.
there were echoes of it here. What my body missed was what was happening there. And I felt that there was an intrinsic thing that was missing from some of the experiences I was having here. And so Carnival shifted in one way because I was then able to relook at this thing that I knew that perhaps everybody in Trinidad knows, a lot of Caribbean people know, but have different ways of articulating
Or have not articulated it.
or have not articulated it. Because
I think sometimes we don't because we don't have
yeah,
to.
yeah, exactly. So I said two things. That's one. I think on the other, it's this thing about, when you're removed from a thing, the thing becomes more precious. And when it becomes more precious, you kind of keep it in a capsule and you kind of preserve it in a way that doesn't in your memory, in your being, it doesn't evolve. But this thing is evolving without you, right? You're not home. So this thing is moving on while you're still there holding on to this precious memory of what this thing does for you.
Yeah.
And so for me, the other thing it made me do was realize that in terms of critique, I needed to make contact with home in order to allow this thing to be part of my life. So what it did is it brought me back home periodically, because I can give an example. So in where I am here, the idea of mass as an aesthetic thing to be engaging beyond Carnival is relatively new. And so I had a work in progress piece that I proposed, and it was called Making a Mass, right? Which was here like, wow, how cool, right? And so I was like, yeah, work in progress, making a mass, looking at sort of preparation rituals.
Yeah.
And I went home to do the project, and I sat around a table with, the curators and stuff like that. In fact, I think that was the same time we were in Trinidad together at the Lloyd Best Institute. Sat around the table and they said, okay, so what's the title of your work? And I was like, Making a Mass, work in progress, and everybody was like, yeah, but everybody here makes a mass. So what makes this different, And I was like, oh yeah. So, so it was like, I needed that reminder that this thing that is so unique here is mundane, it's prosaic, it's happens, it's embedded, it's us. So then what is this thing? What makes it unique? So the title had to change. What it does is it keep in connection with that navel string allows me to sort of be part of the shifts that happen, because the shifts, while what I remember and recall in my body is important, the shifts, the living shifts are necessary too, in order to sort of like make sense of what this living thing is, because it's a living thing,
It's a living thing, it's a somatic thing. The somatics of the experience really stands out when you speak about it, right? So it's this thing that I'm articulating that lives in my body, that's ancestral, that's older than me, that I am playing with, and I have to play with it differently in different spaces. So that playing stands out to me. You referenced Juve, and we have to talk about Juve. As you're going between two spaces, one very familiar, and tell me, when you're away from the space, you're living in the legacy of what lives in your body, but in a foreign space, and you're reconnecting with it at home. How does that change your experience of Carnival at home, though, or change your experience of mass and mass making? Does it? Like, is Trinidad a place you go to refuel?
It is.
Or I don't know, just what happens when you do that?
It is. I get goosebumps because, I think, I know not every person living outside of home space feels like this. I'm aware.
Yeah.
For me, I recognize it. I'm
Yeah.
a lot of people.
I had a shift with that. I thought about everybody living outside a home space doesn't necessarily feel like that, but it really depends on why you had to leave. I think a lot of our relationship with home is tied to that migration story, right? Um, and to even tying back to what you said earlier about how when you leave home, sometimes you romanticize home, but some of us leave for different reasons because it isn't a gem and it isn't a romanticized place, and how we carry it may be different. But I interrupted you.
No, necessarily so, I think. Yeah, I completely acknowledge that.
Yeah.
Our journeys are very, very different. And I think when I left, my migration story was about education. I wanted to do my master's somewhere else. But I think also, I always thought I was coming back. It was never a permanent move in my head. It was always a
Yeah.
temporary thing. And then life took over, children, and all the reasons why not to. But it's still in my head. I'm still moving back at some point. Um, it's not just about mass. It's very much about um, just being at home. One of the things that is evident is an exhale that happens. There is definitely a refueling, and I know when I come back, people say I walk differently, I stand differently.
Mhm.
There's an echo of Trinidad still resonating there. I remember at home when I see women walking and I see the sway, I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
yeah, that's how we walk. Because here you stiffen your sway, not deliberately, but it's colder, it's whatever, and there's less of the flow, the rhythm. So
Yeah.
actually, in my body, it actually feels very differently. So Carnival, yes, Trinidad more so. I think though that there's an openness to all of what the Carnival space sort of invites or allows. Whereas, so I think before the migration, particularly those moments in Juve that can become quite wild and almost dangerous on the
Yeah.
brink, there's a sort of acknowledgement that that too is necessary. It's understanding the place or the space that carnival or mass allows to be the space for all of it. It's the space for all of it. They talk about like who I don't know who the they is, but this idea of the living, the dead, and the unborn dance undistinguished at carnival time. It links back to the all are we as one scenario, but it also acknowledges that carnival makes space for everything, the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it. Because not just that it's a space for sort of purging in a way, but it's also just the nature of the space is inclusive. So it's a space for all of it. So I think the acknowledgement of recognizing that all of it is necessary. It's a kind of an appreciation for the wild and the wonderful.
The wild and the wonderful. I love that. This notion of it holding space for unruliness as well. That point about Juve, which is this release, this freedom, it's liberating. It could be dangerous. It has edges, and we play with those edges. And those edges frighten us sometimes. And those of us who engage in Juve, it's about stepping into that fear as well.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, so I'm taken by your visual artist. You come on one ear. Somebody say, "Hey, Mama, that is math."
Mhm, mhm.
And now you're delving into performance. Yeah. How has performance helped you represent or explore rupture? And rupture in terms of identity, rupture in terms of the flow of who you are, um, as a human and as an artist. That's a wild, wide open question. Where does it land for you?
I feel like this too has shifted over time, but I think the essential thing is the turn back into your body. And I think, you see, I feel like I'm still kind of settling with this. I'm still kind of working this out. But I often feel that the journeys we make or the journeys that I am making is a return to self, like going back to self. And it's kind of curious because at the moment, I'm blurring the boundary between the art and the everyday, right? And
Mhm.
so it's not that I'm wearing canvas in the kitchen or anything like that. I mean, what I mean is like I'm recognizing the performative in the everyday and the rituals in the art, right? Your question is gone.
That's fine. That's fine because I actually wanted to ask you, how does ritual performance function as a method or methodology?
I have a story. Uh, there was one day when I had a conversation with my second son, and we didn't really end on good terms. And so we went to bed kind of grumpy. And when
Okay.
I woke up, I called my mother and I said, "Oh, I'm feeling like I need to do a ritual that is about cleansing. I need to kind of do something and scrape something away because it just feels really that I need to do something physical, a ritual as a, a symbol, a symbol of dealing with something that is happening, right? So a symbolic way of dealing, a representative way of dealing with this thing. So I'm thinking, oh, something like impasto and scraping off the impasto and blah, blah, blah. Just telling her this very exaggerated ritual that I can do to help cleanse the situation between me. And she said, why don't you just clean your house? I'm like, yeah, 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 I'll clean, but I really want to do this thing. And she's like, okay. And after the conversation, I realized, oh, yeah, maybe I should just clean the house, right? So I started to mop and sweep. And I realized, and I've said this before, but I realized that, your labor, your sweat can be libation, and the work itself is the ritual. How do you allow that notion of cleanse? It's all about intention, right? So how do you allow that notion of cleansing to then inform that ritual of release and the ritual of. So she was right, of course. Your mothers are always right.
Always right. Always right about these things. Always.
Yeah, I didn't need to do any impasto scraping, anything. I just needed to listen and to recognize the rituals in the everyday and sweat as libation. And so it shows up like that in terms of the everyday, in terms of the art practice itself. There's a lot of work, there's a lot of behind the scene work that is around intention, around particularly for me, looking at African diaspora spirituality, um, and utilizing things like colors. This is very sort of like very plain, looking at things like colors, acknowledging sort of on in the Ifa calendar, like what day is it today? Today is Shango Day, or today's, what day it is and what colors are significant. What music can inform the work that you're doing. So how does music allow you to flow? So I've done a series of pieces that echo a lot of the sort of Ifa deities as well as some Voodoo deities as well around, Izuli Danto, Eshu, Ogun, Yemoja, all of those things. And it's sort of like playing with what it means to acknowledge nature. Because for me, Ifa and that tradition is about nature, is about earth energy, that kind of thing. And so I allow that to flow through my practice and acknowledge it through my practice. So I went through a massive phase of kind of doing that. I think now the work, which ties into the ritual, is very much centered on the individual me and working out how to show. Before I finish this, I want to just say I recognize that this is not an issue for everybody. And I don't know if
Oh,
it's a Black woman thing. I don't know if it's a migration thing, if it's a colonial thing, right? But this thing about what it means to show up as yourself and not be afraid of the implications of that. I feel like I've moved through life for a long time trying to be the good girl, whatever that means, right?
yeah.
From school, whatever, and pleasing and responding in the way that feels right for the situation, not necessarily right for Adéọlá, right? And so for me, it's sort of like a quietening. It's a stillness that is like, okay, how do you feel about what's just been said? And how do you feel to respond here? And it has to start from silence. It can't be responsive or reactive because then it's coming from somewhere else. It's not coming from gut. It might be coming
Yeah.
from head. It may be coming from habitual
Yeah.
responses rather than what's in here, what wants to be said here or not said. Also, for
Yeah.
me, that's where the ritual is leaning. Again, it's blurring between practice and lie. And it's very much rooted in going back to self. Like, what is
Yeah.
this Adéọlá? And what is the way she needs to respond in this place and this space right now?
Yeah. Woo! I love it. 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 And I'll tell you why I'm loving it. I'm thinking about the interiority, the ways in which going home or being at home really means getting comfortable with you and taking time to do that. How not being around the familiar really opens up space to do that as well.
Mhm.
I'm thinking about when your mother say go and clean your home, because I feel like all of our mothers thinks that's the solution to every problem, right? Like the way to start to fix this problem is go and clean your house. But and so like we're talking, but I'm still 10 minutes ago when you talked about sweater's libation, and connecting that to ritual and just the ancestral belonging of that. Like this is what we have is our labor and what that means for us from a part of the world that's shaped by violence, that's shaped by enslavement and indentureship. So I'm just buzzing with lots of sensations and thoughts, but the beauty of your practice, there's a beauty in which I'm hearing you saying, this is about self. And we started off by talking about performing self, and self is a return to this thing that's always been here. It's also giving yourself full permission to be and sit with it, the silence that's necessary. So it feels to me, and I don't know what it is for you, but it feels to me that creating and performing means that you have to listen to your body. Like that's an integral part. That's an integral part of your practice. Um, and we talked about vulnerability and uncertainty a little bit, and I wondered about the role of improv. So there's all of these things happening. Your life is happening and unfolding, and your art is unfolding at the same time, and continuously grappling with our evolving and emerging self. So I guess my question is, what's the role of improvisation in making art and in making performance? And how does that flow for you?
So, with dance, you could have something choreographed, or you could just allow yourself to play, right? And with play, there are certain steps you have to go through in order to get to what it is your body actually wants to do.
Yeah.
So you can, in my experience, this is in dance now. I'll just kind of say this because I think it's kind of relevant. Uh, I experience first the very self-conscious. Okay, so the music is thing, and maybe there are other bodies in the space moving, and it happens in Carnival too, where you are aware of yourself moving, and you might do what your body remembers from something. You might begin to repeat those kind of familiar movements. If allowed to move beyond that phase, and I think this is what Carnival in Trinidad allows in terms of the duration of this thing, because it's such a long period of time that I eventually get to the point where there is no one around me. And you are in a zone where the music is leading and your body is responding to what it needs to do, even if it's just chipping, whatever it is,
Yeah.
you're at that space. And so for me, improvisation is an invitation to get in touch. And it takes its time, particularly if you're trained in something. I did a project called Play Yourself, and it was a dawn dance, the
Oh,
echoing juve and that kind of thing. I invited dancers and non-dancers, and I invited drummers. And the invitation was the same for everyone, which is to do what your body feels like doing. And the dancers found it the hardest because they were like, but are you going to tell us what, is there a theme? Is there a, and I'm like, yeah, just do what your body wants to do. And they're like, yeah, but are we They needed
Yeah.
some instruction. And eventually, with time, as the sun rose, you know, bodies were doing what they needed to do, and it didn't matter what other people were doing. Sometimes there was collaboration and movement together, and oftentimes people were just in their own world, and then they spoke about it afterwards. And I think that, yeah, the improvisation is an invitation. Even with
Yeah.
my painting and mark making, it feels like, well, my art occupies different worlds, right? So sometimes it's the very selfish world of using it as a language to express whatever cannot really be expressed in words, because it is a language in itself. So if I'm going through a very difficult time and I don't know how to talk about it, I can draw it, because that language allows me to say the details of everything that I need to be talking about. And that in itself is not choreographed. It's not predetermined. I'm on on paper with pencil, and it's coming up, right? So I guess it could be seen as a kind of improvisation. Music, while drawing as well, allows for that sort of not having to think, trusting your body, trusting your instinct, trusting that what mark needs to happen will happen. There will be a point in time, again, stages where you look at it and go, it needs this, and you make a kind of very direct decision.
Mhm.
But allowing for the improvisation within that process, I think, is really important. It really is an exciting, necessary opportunity, invitation.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious about how Carnival gives us instruction as well. That notion of instruction. Um, yeah. Like I think most of the reasons, the big reason why I struggle as a social scientist is because I want to improvise. And they're like, but I still find ways to improvise. But and one of the things I'm coming to, like, I may be in a particular discipline, but the identity that I have embraced, because it's always been has been that I am an artist, and so the lens that I use to look at any issue reflects that deep relationship I have with making
Mhm.
and playing and not needing instruction.
I love it.
I feel so. I feel so. But I wanna play with that notion of carnival instructing us, right? Carnival is being studied at tertiary level institutions. And so there are people doing an inquiry into carnival in different ways. I'm curious about what could carnival teach universities? What is the learning that could be happening? I don't know if you have any thoughts around that. Like, what is the instruction?
Hmm. This could be a thesis in itself, right? It could either be a tweet or a thesis.
One or the other.
I mean, it says something about authority in terms of, particularly within academia, there's always this idea of the expert, right? It says something about the subversion of that, about where
Yeah,
knowledge is held, right? So we know knowledge in carnival spaces are often held in yards.
yeah,
Yards are community spaces. You have okay, you could call it the mass camp, but for traditional mass, it's really the yards, and, the stick fighting yards, or the jab yards, the mountains for the Blue Devils, that's where the knowledge is held. And so
yeah,
there is this subversion of the single academic wisdom that is one person instructing or guiding a bunch of others. There's something there to be learned
yeah,
about where knowledge is held. And I mean, I know there are certain institutes that are welcoming community and doing work across academics and artists and whatever. But there's often this notion that the academic is the one who knows, even if it's a funded project. A lot of the talk is around co-creating and stuff like that, but essentially the community isn't asked what they want. It's that the funding happens and you're inviting the community to partake, how does that knowledge then shift? How does the power shift from one to the other? Whose voice is really being heard? What legs happen as a result of that? Academic papers have legs. And so it's like, it improves your career and you publish. So what does that mean for community? So I think in terms of what Carnival can teach, it's about the sort of where knowledge and power can be held in different spaces and community spaces and communal rather than individual. I think again, it goes back to the somatic and the body and transformation and what it means. And this is sort of evident in the folk tales as well, folk culture and folk tales, where you can have a story about Anansi that is speaking about something that might seem absurd, but is definitely rooted in a real life thing, a real life lesson, but it's told in a way that is fantastical in order to really deeply deal with the issue. When we talk about Anansi and we talk about the trickster and we talk about, the conniving and the means of survival and what it means to transform in order to get the thing that you want, in order to best be in the spaces that you're in. That's a lesson, and it's a post-colonial lesson for sure. It's also a way of dealing with people in diaspora spaces as well. Like I can directly relate to some of those kinds of lessons that come out. And then of course you can go into like our proper folklore when you look at, La Bless and Papa Bois and, Dwens and all of that. And what are the lessons in there? I'm not talking about the obvious ones that scare children, right? But I'm talking about like looking again at what we have and seeing what is the thing we're talking about here? What does this transformation into part beast, part woman mean? What does that mean? And how do we occupy that sort of archetype in a new space? What does that teach? So I think, folk culture, carnival, oh my God, the university has a lot, these academic spaces have a lot to learn from that, but it takes risk.
But you're saying it take risks. There are risks involved.
It may involve letting go of what you think you know. It may involve more experimentation, exploration. It may also involve going back in order to go forward. Yeah, and then again, it goes back to the body. Particularly, you mentioned the word somatic. I think Carnival in particular, it's leading with that. It's leading with the body.
As opposed to the cognition and the theorizing, it's leading with the body. Yeah. It's showing up as yourself, like your staying dirty self.
Yes. Yeah. The self you need. Yeah, because when you think about people who are, and I don't know, I got into this, but it is a particular condition of the Caribbean circumstance, right? So it's this idea that we're rooted in a self that wasn't allowed to fully be yourself, right? So when we think about masking and we think about the jabs and coming from sort of the Hindu tradition 4 or 5 generations ago, worshipping Kali and not being allowed to worship Kali, and then seeing the African brothers, what they're doing in Carnival and how they're mounting and how they're doing their rituals within the guise of Carnival, and recognizing, well, okay, we could worship Kali in this Carnival space, so, they do their fasting before Carnival is the height of their spiritual experiences. So for us, it looks like, oh, yay, look at them, da 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 da. For them, it's a deep, you know what I mean? For them, it's a deep spiritual process. And it's about that sort of masking in mask. But in masking, you are being your authentic self. So it's not masking. I mean, I know this has been spoken about before, but it's not masking to conceal, but masking to reveal, masking to reveal an aspect of yourself that for whatever reason had to be submerged, hidden.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like one of the many things that Carnival has to teach academia is how to be liberatory and subversive and multidimensional.
And plural.
And this and
Plural.
and purer. Yeah, yeah, which goes in the face of the expert.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it holds, as we said earlier, right? It holds space for all, holds space for all of it. There is, rather than the question of this or that, it's this and. It's always and, the plurality is, it doesn't have to make sense. That completely goes against academia, right? But the plurality doesn't have to make sense. The conclusions don't have to be, it's inclusive.
Yeah. Yeah. And you said it goes against academia, but should it? Like there's the power in the opaque. And I think that connects back to that ancestral knowledge and wisdom that there is no answer. That definitely there is no answer as worthy as the courage and the capacity to question and just immerse yourself in it. Love that. Love that. Love that. Love that. Um, so as we're starting to wrap up, can you think of a piece of work that you've done that felt like return or rebirth? And yeah, what would that piece be?
The example I can give is it has to do with performance and performing. So there's a carnival here, and as part of that, I am often, my dad would say, you don't need permission to perform, right? And not but, and as part of that, I'm often invited to perform. And within those spaces, those annual spaces, I take what I have, something from nothing, to make a thing and dance the thing. And I would say in those instances, I feel what you just asked. I feel that sense of the vibration of myself on the street. I feel the capacity to create something from nothing. I understand that within that space, I'm articulating something that is intrinsically connected to my navel string. Uh,
Mhm.
in this new space, you know? So that is the sort of main example that comes to mind when you say that. It is through performance,
And it's happening away from homeland, but it is about home
100%.
in this real way. Continuing along that line, you're in this space, you're not at home, but there are members of the diaspora there, definitely the Caribbean diaspora, the African diaspora as well. What do you think performance offers communities in terms of grief or understanding displacement? Like how does performance offer communities opportunities or spaces to unpack grief and or displacement?
It's interesting because, a dear friend of mine is working within these spaces of death and dying. I know you're not talking about that. You're talking about, displacement and there are different forms of grief or grieving, right? She's working within these spaces of death and dying and Caribbean rituals. And what it means to hold space or make places that facilitate the specifics that we need in terms of understanding death and understanding what that transition means for us. I feel that sort of connected to that. It goes back to the body. It goes back to the kind of honesty of what it means to play things out. I think for me, on a personal level, and dealing with my own displacement or replacement, being in mask or in performance, because for me, in mask and in performance is kind of similar. Being in mask allowed me to work out or resolve something on a level that didn't have to be obvious to the outside person. So it
Mhm.
allows you it allowed me to go deeper. It allowed me to go deeper.
Yeah, without having to expose all of it.
Because I think that's the key with ritual as well, right? So ritual might be in your work, but everybody doesn't have to know that it's there. Your work could be rooted in a specific performative tradition, but it doesn't have to be explicit. What does it mean to hold things to allow things to be the foundation of something without it being an exposition of the thing? What does that mean and how does that empower you? It doesn't, everything doesn't have to be explicit. Everything does not need to be translated. Everything doesn't need to be for everybody's appetite or
Mhm.
spectacle, you know? Yeah. So I feel, yeah, performance allowed that for me, I think.
So this idea of holding space and how ritual, mask, by extension, our carnival and all of its facets, how it holds space for us just to be multiple.
Mhm, mhm.
Thanks for that. That's a beautiful thing to hold. What feels unfinished about your practice?
I can answer that very quickly because I feel like I am still working out what it means to be me. I am still, and I guess that's good because, I'm still alive and I'm still evolving. And so I guess that's good. Again, I'm going back to the fact that I feel like this journey is going back to myself. And I know I've been through different phases. And definitely there are some phases that I can see myself in because I was going through something that is marked on paper or canvas in a very sincere, honest way. Now I'm in that place of remembering. There's a thing I say: how do we remember what we forgot to remember? Right? I'm in that place of, again, trying to get in touch with who I am and remembering what that means and what then that looks like.
Yeah.
I feel it's an evolutionary kind of practice of constantly checking back in. So in terms of something that's unfinished, it is still my practice. It is still what that looks like and what it means to name myself artist. It's still very much what it means to be beyond artist and to just be Adéọlá as form in this place, and how you see, because I recognize practice, my way of articulating my understanding of the world through art as intrinsic to how I show up, right? I understand that true to my expression, but I'm also recognizing that you go through pitfalls and highs and lows, valleys and troughs, right? Constantly in terms of your
Mhm.
practice. And the return back to self.
I wonder about this return to self, remembering, which is repeating. And I'm thinking about the researcher Cynthia Dillard. She talks about remembering ourselves, putting ourselves back together. And that being in response to just colonization and all of these things that pulled us apart, right? And the colonization of education as well, right? The colonial act that is education, not just the history, but the ways in which it
Mm.
continues to live with us. There's a way in which that dismembers us. I'm hearing you speaking about remembering self. Is it also repairing parts, or is it recall?
I feel
Yeah.
like on some levels, there might be aspects of recall. My mother used to say that whatever you enjoyed doing as a child is something that should be part of your life as an adult because it's something that you didn't choose and actively choose, but it's something that brought you joy, right? And for me, it's
Yeah.
a return to love and to joy. How do we say yes to joy and to connect again to that intuitive voice, that feeling that is not necessarily echoed on the outside, but feels right on the inside, makes you smile. It's simple.
Yeah.
It's really, really simple.
Yeah.
And so, in a way, there's an aspect of recall. And I think within that process, there is the remembering of these different parts. Because there is something that, and I've seen it in my own children, there's something that happens along that journey of growing up. I look at some people and I think they're pretending to be adults. Like you're playing the adult, literally, And I
Yeah.
think there's something within that process of growing up, and like you talk about the educational system, that dampens the intuitive voice, that that plays with our heads in a way that we no longer fully trust that raw passion, that raw joy, that raw way of loving that intrinsically makes us happy, And so I think there are aspects of both remembering, bringing those pieces back. It's healing for sure, because, we've got layers and layers of trauma, not just ancestral, even within our own lifetime. We may not recognize as trauma, but when you look back at yourself and you say, but is it true though? Whether it's about self-confidence or whatever, when you ask yourself that question, but is it true? Or where did this start? You realize that whatever trauma you may have experienced as a child, you probably are inadvertently imposing it on yourself again and again and again and again.
Yeah.
So it's like, how do you then release that and, go back to self? So it's remembering, it's healing and recalling.
So often we become our own perpetrators, like we don't have the perpetrator there anymore, and it's okay because we have a perpetrating part that is.
So, again, goosebumps, but it's so true.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so sometimes that perpetrating part continues to block us from doing that thing that your mother said, that thing that always brought you joy.
Yeah.
As we close up, oh gosh, I don't know how to close. There's so many interesting features that came up. I guess I want to ask, is there anything feels unfinished in our conversation?
It's this idea of dancing like Dwen. And, the Dwen is that child character that has these backward feet. Traditionally, it's very much about, children who weren't baptized or whatever, who are lost in the forest and, the feet are backwards so that you can't follow them. You go the wrong direction if you look to follow them. For me, sort of reimagining what Dwen means, it tells me about moving forward with footprints looking back. And it's rooted in this idea that, one, that we're constantly coming back to ourselves, but also ancestrally, that we are rooted in our past, we're standing on shoulders with deep, deep roots. And it's in looking back that we move forward looking back as well. We move forward with our footprints looking back. So we know that we're always sort of like connected to the past as we kind of allow ourselves to move forward. And even within the template of Carnival, it's this idea that we already have all that we need. We already have all that we need. It's just about seeing, recognizing,
Thank you so much for sharing this time. For sharing this time for dancing with me today.
I love dancing with you.
Thank you so much for that. A segment of the audience for this reasoning are students. What blessing might you offer for those navigating rupture or displacement?
I have no wise words. It's something around the fact that we are inherently the ones creating our own experiences of a situation. That there is no inherently good or bad thing, that things just are what they are. And yes, you could, in this sort of world that we live in, we can say that this has been a bad thing and this has been a good thing. Inherently, though, it's the way we see it that informs our experience of it. That is not easy work. Knowing that isn't easy work. It doesn't make situations easier. And the practice of recognizing that, something that takes time, that is a grind, that is sometimes really, really painful to acknowledge. But in the end, it's a liberating thing, recognizing that your frame is what really matters within situations. So keep going.
What a beautiful blessing. Thank you. You have been listening to Saltwater Reasonings, where we gather to think, feel, and reason across waters, disciplines, and geographies of becoming. My thanks to Adeola Dewis for this thoughtful and intimate reasoning. We have explored mass as a method of inquiry, Carnival as a space for transformation, and embodied practice as a form of knowledge that resists silence and erasure. Adeola's reflections invite us to understand performance as a method of care and collective responsibility. To learn more about Adeola's work and find readings, visit tracyrogers.com/saltwater reasonings. I invite you to join me for the next tide in this series as we continue to reason through art, memory, and the work of becoming otherwise.